begin this hour with the U.S. military conducting a second test of an intercontinental ballistic missile just within 1 week of each other. The unarmed Minuteman III missile was launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base in Southern California. And according to the military command, it's sending a message of force to other nations. This latest launch had been reportedly planned for some time, but it took place amid escalating tension on the Korean Peninsula. RT's Alexei Yarshevsky joins me now from the RT newsroom with details. Alexei, what details can you give us about this launch? Well,
we're talking here about the intercontinental ballistic missile called Minuteman III. It is able to carry a nuclear charge, although this time we understand it was unarmed. It's one of the pride and joys of the U.S. military, and they insist that the test of this missile had been planned in advance. Now there are videos online, describing this launch and showing how the rocket goes up in the middle of the night. They say it was planned in advance, but there's actually very little question as to the timing of this, but we'll get to this a little bit later. I just want to say that it was launched from the Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. It flew 4,200 miles before splashing down near Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, where one of the U.S. test fields is located. And as for the timing of it, we do know, of course, that there's a lot of tension now on the Korean Peninsula. And judging by the statement from one of the U.S. military command, in fact, it's Colonel John Moss, head of the Air Force's 30th Space Wing, who said that these Minuteman launches are essential to verify the status of our national nuclear force and to demonstrate our national nuclear capabilities. End of quote. Well, judging by this statement alone, you can figure out where exactly this message was going to. Obviously, this message was going to Pyongyang, and the timing for this could hardly be considered coincidental.
Right. They need a reminding of the force of the U.S. military, apparently. Has there been any reaction from Pyongyang?
Well, Pyongyang has not yet reacted to the latest test, but it's not really hard to figure out what kind of reaction that would be, considering all the saber rattling as of late, considering all the tests that North Korea has held, most of them unsuccessfully. In the past few weeks, even last weekend alone, it reportedly launched a ballistic missile test, but it did not prove to be successful. But there's one very interesting development happening at the Korean Peninsula now. Well, as we know, Pyongyang's biggest ally in the region, and not only ally, but it's also a supplier of energy, water, and pretty much anything you can think of in North Korea, is China. So just on Tuesday, the Central News Agency of North Korea, KCNA, published an op-ed with a commentary saying that a string of absurd and reckless remarks are now heard from China every day only to render the present bad situation tenser. The statement continued by saying that China had better ponder over the grave consequences to be entailed by its reckless act of chopping down the pillar of the Korean-China relations. So you see the language there, reckless act of chopping down the pillar of relations. This is something unheard of in terms of the conversation between Pyongyang and Beijing, and this is something that is a very unexpected development, of course, in the context of what's going on in the Korean Peninsula. We'll be closely watching where this goes.
We certainly will. Thanks, Alexei.
Tonight, senior foreign affairs correspondent Greg Palkot talks with a North Korean defector with plenty to say about what's going on there and how the world is responding.
Hunsa Lee is one of the best-known defectors from North Korea, and at only 37, one of the most outspoken about the controlling North Korean regime of Kim Jong-un.
North Korean regime really good at control people. I think they are the best dictator in this whole planet.
After fleeing North Korea in 1997 when she was still in her teens, and then following difficult years in China, she finally made it to South Korea and the West. Her book, The Girl with Seven Names, referring to the aliases she used during her escape, is a global bestseller. Her TED Talk speech has been viewed online some 13 million times. She talks about slavery under the rigid regimes of Kim Jong-un's father and grandfather.
We just only received this much and we don't have enough. So that's how we automatically become the slave of the regime.
She witnessed executions, indoctrination, and a famine in the 90s which left an estimated 1 million dead and abandoned.
Because of so many dead bodies, and there's certain people's job is to get rid of those bodies. And
the job is to get rid of them.
Yeah.
She was also taught about enemy number one, America.
We don't have the words like Americans. but American bastards, it's one word.
One word.
Always American bastards, American bastards.
Fast forward to today and President Trump's tough talk about North Korea. Hun Seo said when she first heard it, she cried.
No any president say that words until today, because even though we have suffered for 7 decades.
The challenge is delivering on that rhetoric. She says North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is a dangerous foe with his nukes and missiles and repression. The killing this year of his half-brother in Malaysia, a warning.
If they want to do something, they could do, because
They could do something against you.
yeah.
Still, she holds on to a dream. Do you think that sometime in your life you'll be able to go back to your old home?
I strongly believe it.
You believe it?
I believe it.
Aside from trying to kill them, the regime of Kim Jong-un brands defectors like Hun Seo Lee liars. We checked her accounts with experts. We were told she's the real deal, and a brave one too. Brett.
Great story. Greg Palcott in London. Greg, thank you.
Mr. Pollack, is President Trump trying to play both hands, trying to have more military presence in the region, while at the same time, see, I'll extend that Oliver branch to you, President Kim, in DPRK?
Well, Tianwei, it's good to talk to you again. President Trump says many things. The Washington Post today has an entire section devoted to the publication of every tweet that he has uttered since he's been president of the United States. And there are, I think the number may run to the thousands. So it's important not to overreact to this, although I would say one thing that's important to note, that there's a lineage for this. Bill Clinton came very, very close to traveling to North Korea at the very end of his presidency. Indeed, Secretary of State Albright encouraged him to do so. He decided it was not appropriate, even though that was kind of the high point in U.S.-North Korea relations. So there's that. There's the fact that subsequently, at different times, Kim Il-sung met with former President Jimmy Carter on the cusp of the possible North Korean nuclear crisis in the 1990s. Bill Clinton traveled to North Korea to bring home several American reporters who had been captured by the North Koreans. So you could argue, in some sense, this would follow logically on that members in the Kim dynasty would feel validated by the presence of a president, preferably active, but sometimes former, may do. But I think it's very important to bear in mind here that Trump says many, many things.
I see.
He may be trying to dangle something to Kim, but it would require Kim to take unprecedented steps that thus far he shows no desire to undertake if any American president would even remotely contemplate this possibility.
Right. Mr. Zhao, here in Beijing, China, of course, the foreign ministry welcomed already at least this tweet by President Trump. But at the same time, you see within the administration, there are mixed voices. President Trump sent this tweet, but at the same time, or said that during an interview, he even honored to meet with the North Korean leader. But at the same time, his administration, particularly his spokesperson of the White House, walked back immediately after he made that remark. Is Washington going to present a mixed picture to Pyongyang, or this is one of those stories of Trump saying more than he should, and then the spokesperson walking it back?
Well, I think, personally, I think Trump is serious in having some engagement with Mr. Kim. He said very good words about Mr. Kim. He said he's a smart cookie. I think he's interested in knowing this young leader better. And he believes that he can develop some interesting relationship with him that is beneficial to the American interests. And also, I think the current administration's North Korea policy after dropping the strategic patience is to impose maximum pressure and then engage with North Korea. So I think Mr. Trump might disagree with his senior staffs on when is the right point to offer dialogue, because if you maintain the maximum pressure for too long, North Korea might, disbelieve and believing that it has to provoke even more. But if you do not maintain enough pressure for enough period of time, you might not get the maximum results from the pressure. So maybe his staff believe that we still need to wait for longer before offer dialogue.
Yeah. I did notice, Mr. Zhao, when you answer a question, you use many, maybe, 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 and maybe. So, having heard that, Ms. Panova, do you think it is a strategic confusion that Washington is trying to create, or strategic ambiguity? There's a huge difference, of course, between these two.
Well, I would say this is probably both. To put the words, I should say that, well, Trump, if you remember how he came into power, right? To my view, he came as a revolt against the establishment. So he's an anti-establishment president, and this allows him to actually break down the Gordian knots of quite a few problems if he has enough power, enough political capital, and enough kind of resolve to do that. And even though this is probably not the time when Trump is to meet Kim Jong-un at this point, but the mere talk about it and the mere kind of preparedness of President Trump to talk about such a possibility, and he speaks freely of any other instance like that. This is the way to break down the tradition, the way to break down the crisis, probably, and lead to some kind of solution to it. Our first counterpart spoke rightly about President Clinton coming close to actually mending the ties with a North Korean nation. I'm remembering it as well because Russia was one of their, and personally Putin was one of those.
Professor Panova, talking about Russia,
took part in talking to North Korea.
Yeah, we did notice, Professor Panova, that Russian President Putin, after meeting with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, talked specifically about the DPRK nuclear issue. He said still talks and dialogue really is the way to go, and this is the right time. There were earlier, Professor Panova, if you want me to be frank, rumors about whether DPRK want to divide the six parties involved in the six-party talk by getting ever closer to Russia. Obviously, with the open statement from Russian president, it seems that things are going not necessarily that way. So, President Putin, what do you think Professor Panova is trying to make here? Is he trying to talk about the timing is exactly right? How much can Russia push about a dialogue or talk of some sort?
Well, probably Russia is not in the strongest position in order to move North Korea closer to any decision in the proper direction, right? But obviously Russia wants to be sustainable in terms of saying that it wants only diplomacy and negotiations.
Yeah.
And it does have ties with North Korea, and being mostly in Vladivostok, I see that, for example, there are quite a few North Korean migrants, labor migrants working in the country. So, and this is economically sustainable for North Korea. So Russia also has a way of cooperating politically, economically with North Korea, and obviously plays a role in that. And also for Russia, it is vital that along its borders in Asia Pacific and its neighborhood, it keeps stable. So for this ends, obviously Putin's statement is just supporting their proper development of events, and that is why I think Trump's words can be only welcome, especially after this alert and alarm that everybody had with their the North American fleet coming to close and exercising.
That's right. Therefore, the timing is extremely important, Mr. Polak. How is the debate about timing to have dialogue and talk in Washington now? Where are you stand?
Well, there are a couple of things we need to bear in mind. First of all, the talk of all the increased tensions in U.S. military deployments, this is seasonal. This happens every year. Every March and April, the United States conducts major joint exercises with the Republic of Korea. Every March and April, North Korea threatens to blow up the White House, attack South Korea, makes all kinds of threatening noises. I don't trivialize these things. They have an inherent danger, and so there is always a risk of miscalculation. But we've been here before.
But
I could
Mr.
walk you back through many
Mr.
years.
Polak, I have to remind you that it is possibly during the Trump administration that North Korea, if continuing on the current path, could develop ICBM and could reach the United States. That is the huge difference that we are talking about here compared to, let's just say, decades of DPRK nuclear issue.
It could be, but I think that that it is premature to assume such a capability. And I would note, Tianwei, that if the concern in the near term was the possibility that North Korea would conduct a 6th nuclear test and conduct a long-range missile test, they have done neither. And that's a good thing that they haven't done them.
So
the question is whether you can build on that.
So your suggestion, I'm just trying to figure out what you're thinking right now, Mr. Polak, because you are one of those very influential scholars in the U.S. about this. What are you thinking? So you're saying nothing important at this point. Let's just leave it like that. Or is the United States taking the time to build this military around the region so that eventually, at the proper time, as U.S. see it, take military action? What exactly is going on right here?
I see zero possibility, that the United States will conduct anything preemptive against North Korea, certainly in the present context. The only context in which that would ever be imaginable would be under a situation of imminent crisis where there are unambiguous indicators of North Korea about to use a long-range missile capability against the United States. I see all of these things are based on conditions assuming that North Korea ultimately has that capability. But Tianwei, I must emphasize, there's one factor here we haven't talked about at all, and that is that next week South Korea will elect new president. And it will very likely be Moon Jae-in. The South Koreans never like decisions to be made over their heads. Anything that happens here, whether it's in terms of initiatives towards North Korea or anything that is thought about at other levels, must have the explicit understanding and concurrence of the government of the Republic of Korea.
Right.
And Japan is also a factor in this, so we cannot ignore those factors.
You made a great point, Mr. Polak. Mr. Zhao, I want to go to you about that. It is not just the nuclear crisis, it is elections taking place in South Korea. It is election with a candidate who's likely to win, likely to go warmer relations with North Korea. It's also a crisis, from crisis probably to opportunities at this time, if we could be optimistic here. Mr. Zhao, where are we?
I think we are facing an important historical opportunity. As Mr. Polak just said, President Clinton failed to have time to go to Pyongyang and have a state head level visit. I think Mr. Trump can avoid making that same mistake by proposing dialogue with Pyongyang sooner rather than later. I think the recent Mr. Trump's statement about engagement might also be influenced by what is developing in South Korea. Right. The likelihood of a liberal South Korean president might have convinced Mr. Trump that he has to engage with North Korea in the near future. The point is really what's the right time to propose dialogue. The U.S., also open to dialogue, has also said repeatedly that there are preconditions to be met by North Korea before any engagement to take place. So I think the current postures by all parties, U.S. and North Korea, are all aimed at negotiating the best bargaining chips. What's the best preconditions that North Korea can accept, or from the U.S. perspective, can the U.S. to force North Korea to accept before going into negotiations? I think that's something that more economic sanctions won't be able to change, but more offer of dialogue will go a long way to diffuse the tensions.
Mr. Polak, I want you to be brief on this, but it's very important. Mr. Polak, I understand there are already news suggesting that the State Department officials visited President Carter, who used to be quite a go-betweener between North Korea and the United States and briefed President Carter, the previous president, about the latest situation. Of course, without further statements coming out of it. Are we seeing some kinds of movements going on in Washington about, seeking a different path?
Well, when the administration has said all options are on the table, you could argue that could go in any number of different directions. I think they are casting about for what the possibilities are, but I think we must come back to the fundamental fact. Kim Jong-un has made the possession and the enhancement of missile capabilities and nuclear capabilities an embedded part of his strategic identity and his goals. He's personally identified with this. Unless and until he can demonstrate meaningfully that he is prepared to look at a different future for the DPRK, I think that the possibilities of any kind of bold gesture by the United States are much more remote. That said, the United States has never been averse to dialogue. There's a difference between dialogue and negotiation.
I see. Before we go, I do want to have the other two briefly help us to understand where your country stands. Russia. That Russia is against. On the other hand, Russia concerned about security on the border if DPRK collapse or even military actions began. And also Russia have a very interesting relationship right now with the Trump administration and Washington. So, Professor Panova, how much can Russia play its role and its stakes?
Well, as I said earlier, it's still Russia still has quite a good relation with North Korea. It has a number of not leverages, but obviously points where it can join in, and it will do anything possible for it to play the diplomatic hand into diplomatic hands, so not to allow for any crisis to break out. And even though I would agree that probably the full-scale dialogue between North Korea and United States is still a remote thing, even with all their Trump's anti-establishment and very anti-establishment moves and possibilities. At the same time, I think we can have some more progress on six-party talks if they are, and North Korea might feel safer and try to move forward as well.
All right, very briefly, only 15 seconds for you, Mr. Zhao. What about China? Debate in China after Madam Fu Ying's article as well.
Yeah, I think China has already, over the last few months, greatly stepped up its economic pressure against North Korea by cutting coal export from North Korea, and also reportedly even might have reduced oil export into North Korea.
So your point is?
So the point is, I think China will be very pleased by this recent signal from Washington. China is willing to facilitate any direct engagement between relevant parties, regardless of the format, whether it's six-party talks or 5 or 4-party talks. China is very experienced in hosting these dialogues, as long as other countries allow China to make a contribution.
We have to wrap it up, but we're running out of time. Zhao Tong, Jonathan Pollack, and Victoria Panova, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we're going to have time to discuss this sometime later in the program.